Well, welcome everyone to another podcast supporters evening. And I thought we'd have something a little bit different this time. We're going to look at postcards of the First World War. Now, I've been collecting these for a very, very long time. It's over 40 years. It was something that I realized quite early on in my interest in the Great War, living in Sussex, which had lots of junk shops. There was a Saturday market down in Brighton, which was only a short hop, skip, and a jump from where I lived at that time, that you could go down to places like that, and there would be these incredible kind of artifacts that connected us with the history of the Great War available at what was then incredibly cheap prices. I mean, literally, sometimes these cards were pennies, no one wanted them, and often dealers would kind of give you a whole wad of them for almost nothing, really. Now, that's kind of changed a little bit over the course of those 40 years, and those kind of markets and those kind of shops selling them have all kind of faded away. You can still buy. I mean, I've bought the odd postcard in a junk shop in recent years. There are still postcard fairs. Where I live now in Kent, there's one down the road in Canterbury on a regular basis. But obviously online, there's a whole host of stuff. So it is quite an accessible part of Great War collecting. And I had a question on the Q&As about, collecting, what you should collect. What's the kind of a gateway collection? And certainly postcards are one of it. And hopefully tonight you'll get a sense of what you can find and what you can discover and what you can understand through the medium of postcards, if you like, because they are a really important part of the history of the Great War. All of the images that you're going to see tonight, bar the first couple, as you'll see why, which are about photography, which I didn't have a suitable postcard to kind of illustrate that, but all of the rest are from my collection. It actually was incredibly difficult to try and pull out some some of the postcards or some relevant postcards, because where do you start? I mean, I've literally got thousands of these. It is thousands. I have no idea how many thousands, but it is thousands. But I hope that what we'll see tonight, while we'll not be covering every type of postcard, every postcard kind of genre, and every element of the war that postcards covered, nevertheless, I hope it'll give you a bit of a kind of introduction to it. So let's begin. So when we kind of think of imagery of the First World War, we think of official photographs. Those are the images that really kind of populate the books that we read about the Great War, and many of them taken by photographers like this, Lieutenant Brooks, Baby Brooks, Ernest Brooks, who was one of a number of official cinematographers who were professionals on the outbreak of war, and then through the War Office became these official photographers. That didn't really happen until midway through the Great War, and the period leading up to the Battle of the Somme in 1916 was the first time really that the army at the front had been properly photographed. Prior to that, it had been press photographers, local photographers, and the soldiers themselves. Those private images of the Great War are not what we're going to talk about tonight. That's really a separate talk. And there's some really good books on period cameras and also those images. Richard Van Emden, great friend of this podcast, fantastic First World War historian, has written extensively from his own collection of private images, and you can kind of follow that up there. But Brooks is kind of typical, I think, really, of the official approach to photographs. But that's not what we're really talking about. What we're going to look at is the outcome of a phenomena, really, that happened in those decades leading up to the First World War. And that phenomena was the advancement in photography and the widespread use of postcards as a medium to place photographs on, and making them popular and also accessible to a greater population by making them cheap. And local photographers like this gentleman on the left, and cameras like the ones we see in this advert from a manufacturer, from a photographer in Basingstoke, gives us a bit of an insight into that period, that Edwardian period. And what we see is a development of this through the late 19th century on into the early 20th century. And it combined as well with not just the ability to take photographs, because that was something that was now decades old, but to print them in a easy way and make them cheap enough for ordinary people to buy. And this is a good example of that. Now, this is not a view I think possibly any of you will recognise. It is a station road in Crawley in Sussex, town where I grew up. And when I was a kid, this road really didn't look any different to this. It leads down to the main church in what was the town centre then, and images like this that showed Edwardian Britain, the place where you lived, were very popular. People would buy postcards of their town, of their church, of important civic buildings. And then if you went on holiday somewhere, you would buy this kind of image. Now, this is a photograph that has then been printed and also tinted. So it's a colorization process, this. It's not a color photograph. It's often done with certain types of paints to colorize a black and white image to make it more accessible in exactly the way, I guess, modern colorists with digital images do today. But this kind of postcard and this color type of image showing anything from a town to a seaside resort to a mountain to a beautiful river scene with a bridge over it. These were incredibly popular in that period, and people bought postcard albums to collect these kind of things as a kind of aid memoir to their life and put them in there. And again, if you don't have to go far in junk shops to see that kind of thing, but that kind of image was to a degree one-dimensional. What people really liked, and collectors now look for these, are real photographic images where the local photographer has gone out and photographed something and reproduced that on a postcard as an actual photograph with a postcard back, so you can write on it and you can address it to someone, put a stamp on it, send it in the post. But it gives you a much clearer glimpse, really, into what Henry Williamson called the old world. And it's very apt for me to mention Williamson because this is hilly fields in Ladywell near Lewisham in southeast London. And Williamson lived just behind the photographer in a little side street that was right on the edge of hilly fields. And this gives today, over a century on, it's images like this that are incredibly important documents in the social history of Britain before the First World War and give us a glimpse into what society was, how they dressed, what they did, and what was important to them. So, from the context of the First World War, this was important because the development and the interest and the want for images like this were all part of what would happen with images of the First World War. Also, was at the same time, there was a widespread desire for studio photographs or portrait photographs. People would go and have their portrait taken. And these are two pre-war images, typical of the kind of things that were put onto postcards. The young lady on the left, Gladys, she's a Barnsley girl. She was born in Barnsley. She grew up in Barnsley. And tragically, her brother would be killed serving as an officer with the Royal Field Artillery in 1915. Also, of course, from Barnsley himself. And the lad on the right this is an image taken by a photographer's studio in Manchester before the Great War. And he's very kindly signed it, which gives us a bit of an indication as to who he was. And he served with the Manchester Pals when they were formed on the outbreak of the war. Now, those are the kind of subsequent histories of these two individuals, but the images, the kind of images that we see here, were very, very popular in the Edwardian period. Everyone was having their photograph taken, and they would have them to give to relatives, to prospective boyfriends, girlfriends, to hand out to just about anybody, under all kinds of different circumstances. They were part of the societal currency, I think, of the day in so many, many ways. So really, really important in that respect. And that kind of filtered into military life. So you start to see similar kind of images to what you'd have seen depicting civil life and individuals in civil life now in military service. And this is a very early postcard taken, it's an image taken just after the Boer War, showing some men from the Royal Sussex Regiment, giving us a fantastic insight into what typical soldiers in the Edwardian army in those early 1900s looked like, wearing, in this case, they got their best dressed tunics. These would have been red. They've got their regimental badges on. The Royal Sussex badge was slightly different at this part of its history. They're sitting on rubbish bins or the Dixie for the stew or the tea. They've got their leather equipment, white buff leather equipment hanging up in the middle of the tent behind them, and their mess tins and their rifles in there as well. And it's a fantastic image, really clear, because cameras, the kind of cameras that we saw in that advert, had very large glass negatives that were really high resolution. And they then produce images like this, where today, when we put them on a scanner, we can literally zoom in and pull out incredible detail from them. So high quality images. And soldiers, just as they had in civilian life, gone to get their photograph taken, got the family together to have their photograph taken. This is their new family. This is their army family, their service family, and they want a similar kind of photograph. And you very often have this kind of image produced following a significant event, training, a camp, whatever it is. And also soldiers, as the kind of postcard business, and it was a really big business in Edwardian Britain, progressed, even barracks would produce their own postcards. So if you were posted to a particular barracks, and I think this is Mill Hill Barracks in London, then they would produce a postcard that you could then go and buy and then send that home to your mum or your wife or your girlfriend or all three of them, whatever it was. And soldiers then collected these if they were posted around different barracks during that period of their military service. And again, this gives us, as historians, those interested in the First World War and that period, a glimpse into what barracks life was like in that period, what barracks looked like, how men behaved in those barracks, and how they kind of fitted into the wider society at that time. Military service and the army generally, was not popular in the Edwardian period. They were, just as 100 years before with the Peninsular War, I don't think they quite described them as the scum of the earth, but it was not looked as a kind of a profession for anyone who was succeeding in life. But, as we know from the verse of Kipling, it's Tommy this and Tommy that. But when the bullets start to fly, then soldiers are obviously very important again. But even now, those were regular soldiers in those previous images, but even part-time soldiers would also be very keen to have their image taken. And this is a typical photograph of a territorial unit. It's the 4th Battalion Royal Sussex Regiment. As you know, I'm from Sussex, big interest in that regiment, so I've got a lot of postcards of the Royal Sussex. And this was taken on one of their annual camps, probably around about 1910-11, at Arundel Park in what is now West Sussex. Arundel Park, the Duke of Norfolk owned it, and he let the regiment use the grounds of the park right up to their disbandment in the 1960s. And I think he was honorary colonel at various points during its history. But this kind of image, again, it shows us a different soldier, a new soldier in some respects. The old volunteers are now Saturday night soldiers, they're territorials. And these men are not full-time warriors, they are part-time. And we see a different kind of soldier, perhaps, to the man who is a regular full-time soldier in the British Army. And I think as well, it's, some of these images are incredible photographs. Many of these, what were essentially amateur turned professional photographers, captured images that to me are classic images of the 20th century, and also that kind of draw us to the faces of those that are in them. And I think this is a very, very good example of that, where the faces in it are very strong and the kind of our eye is drawn to them. The kind of faces in many respects that we wouldn't see in a modern photograph today. And it can give us into an insight, these images that were put on the postcard, into aspects of military life that we don't always consider. So this is another Royal Sussex postcard, yes, but it's the 5th Battalion, the Cinque Ports Battalion, and this is their officers' mess at their annual camp just before the Great War. So these are the mess waiters, and they are about to serve the officers of the battalion, which was Lieutenant Colonel Langham and one or two others. And All of those in this image were ordinary soldiers in the 5th Battalion. All would go on to take part in the Battle of Albers Ridge in May of 1915, only a few years after this photograph was taken. And perhaps some of them died in that battle. Sadly, like so many of these images, there's no names on the back of this one, but it gives us a glimpse into the finery of the military. You've got the regimental silver on the table here. It's a world away from the kind of conditions that these men only a few years later would have been living in. And I think that is also the kind of value of these. We see the contrast in that progression towards war in 1914 and the experience of the ordinary soldier. And then when the war begins, postcards very, very quickly, the government realise the value of postcards being so popular. I mean, there are literally millions and millions of postcards produced every year before 1914 and sent all over Britain, all over the wider empire. So the government think, well, people are very much kind of into postcards. It's part of their life. Let's use postcards to send a message to the wider population about the righteousness of the war and the messages that we want to say about that war. So this is a very early 1914 image showing what women were doing on the front line, how nurses were part of the battlefield, with a typical kind of catchy slogan on it. She hasn't a sword and she hasn't a gun, but she's doing her duty now. Fighting's begun. And this kind of postcard, which kind of veers towards sentimentality, shows an image that I can absolutely guarantee is not taken on any battlefield. The wall in the background looks more like kind of Shropshire or Wales than the Western Front, but it was all part of engaging a country into war and making them understand that this was a war that was going to affect everybody. And by everybody, we also mean everybody within the empire. So you see a lot of images of that period pushing the importance of empire and empire troops in the struggle. So this absolutely fantastic photograph of two Indian soldiers taken in late 1914, posed for the camera. I'm not sure how much they would have liked having to salute a cameraman like that, but nevertheless, this is a classic image showing two Indian warriors about to go to the Western Front to take part in some of the key battles, and the first time in the history of Britain and its empire that soldiers from India had come to a European theatre of war to fight. So this massive kind of turning point in British history is very much marked, is very much pinned by the images that we see in these postcards from the First World War. And when it gets on to, how the war develops and the fighting and the big battles, we see official photographs being put out there as propaganda as well, often colorized, just like the pre-war images of Crawley High Street or Crawley, that street in Crawley that we saw. These images were hand tinted to give a degree of color to make them attractive to a wider audience. People collected them. The Daily Mail published a whole series of these kind of images in sepia, in black and white, and in color like this. And the images were carefully selected to give a positive view of the war and focus more on achievement, more on bravery, more on sacrifice than the darker side of the war, which, as the war rolled on, became more and more apparent even to the to an ordinary person. And even in the kind of wider empire, you see this as well. So this is part of a series of images that was produced by the Canadian official photographers that worked on the Western Front. And this shows a captured dog from Courcelette, obviously another place that's connected to me. There's the original black and white image of this taken by the Canadian official photographer. There's a black and white postcard version of this that was sold, and then another hand-tinted colorized version that was sold in even greater numbers because it was color, because the idea of color photography was something that was very, very new. True color photography, this is not it, of course, did exist by the end of the First World War, but it was not put into postcards. Postcards were never, color images were never published on postcards certainly in Britain and its wider empire by the end of the First World War. It would take a long time for that to happen. But again, what we're seeing, Battle of Courcelette, September to November of 1916, 24,000 Canadian casualties, 8,500 Canadians killed in action, of which 6,000 were missing. And the focus image that they want the public to buy connected to that battle is about a dog, a German dog, captured in a dugout of Courcelette during the advance and being held up by a Canadian officer. But that's the kind of purpose of these images. And then there were a lot of these kind of sentimental cards that were sold again in huge numbers. And there's loads and loads of different sets of these showing images like this with a soldier dreaming of his family or his girl or his wife or his mother or whatever it is. Very sentimental, very schmaltzy. The verses are kind of pretty not particularly good either, but they give us an insight into the relationship between an ever-growing army made up largely of civilian soldiers and how then they tried to retain their civilian identity and attachment to their family through being in military service. And it's all kind of part of that. And again, these were bought in huge numbers, sent in huge numbers, and kept by soldiers in huge numbers. You see photographs of dugouts during the First World War in France and Flanders with these things pinned up in the dugout. So they were obviously pretty popular. But when the soldiers got onto the actual battlefield, they found a very different type of postcard that they then began to purchase, acquire, swap with each other. Just as when they'd gone on holiday to Bognor and bought a picture of the postcard of the pier, they're not on holiday anymore. They're on the front line in Flanders, but they're coming across cities and towns and villages and architecture and places and buildings like they have never seen. And all round that kind of battlefield area were still, particularly in the early war period, a lot of civilians. And in Ypres, the civilian population stayed there until April of 1915. And there were shops selling postcards like this. This is an image from about 1910, 1912. It would have been printed on postcard to be sold to the good people of Ypres before the war. And now there's thousands of soldiers who want postcards of Ypres. They've seen the ruinous building that this has become, and they want to see an image of what it looked like before, so they buy that and then send that home to their mum. So soldiers are beginning to buy postcards now that don't mark the kind of bookmarks of their holidays, of their early life. They're purchasing postcards that act as beacons to their service on these battlefields of the Great War. And all kinds of landmarks get photographed and get put onto postcard. We just had an episode about the Albert Bapaume Road for the podcast, and we started off in Albert beneath the Basilica, the Basilique, and this is two postcards of that showing the original statue, golden statue of Mary on the left, with her outstretched arms holding the infant Jesus, and then what that became once German shells hit the tower in 1915 and it topples over at its 90-degree angle, this incredible landmark that became so familiar to soldiers who were there during the First World War. I mean, that image or images showing that structure must have been sent home, particularly in 1916, in their hundreds of thousands, if not more, because it was such a familiar landmark to that generation that marched to the Somme and literally marched through the Somme battlefields in 1916. And, these are the kind of images that when I went to interview the veterans in the 1980s and 90s, they would often have these tucked away. Sometimes they'd have their last pay book, and tucked in their pay book was a wad of these showing the places, their kind of souvenirs of the places where they'd served at different points during the Great War. And you can have mighty buildings that you've seen. You can have landmarks like the Leaning Virgin, or you can just have, and there are thousands of different versions of postcards like this showing buildings in a village where you've just served, which connects you to that particular battle that you've just taken part in. This is the ruins of the church at Loos, where the Battle of Loos was in September and October of 1915. But Soldiers also bought pictures of places that were actually behind the German lines, which you might think a bit curious. So this is a postcard of Chapval Chateau, which British soldiers would have seen from the front line as a ruin from the edge of Chapval Wood when British troops first arrived there in the summer of 1915. Later, the Ulster Division took over that sector. They would have seen the ruins of this mighty building in the distance, and back in Albert and back in the villages behind the front, they could buy postcards like this. So, although they'd never set foot in Chapval and they'd never gone into the chateau, it too was a kind of part of their story. And these kind of images of places that were behind the German front were just as popular. And I guess on the German side, and we're not really going to touch on the kind of German and French and other nations' postcards in this talk because that is a kind of separate talk in its own right. But the Germans would have had access to similar kind of images, if not the same images. And Georges Lalonde, whose name is at the bottom of the postcard, who lived in, his shop was in 21 Rue Saint Martin in Amiens. He was a very well-known local postcard publisher before the Great War, and I think a man who must have made an absolute fortune in the Great War because he cornered the market in images like these of all of the villages, all of the places. He took as much as he could. He tried to get near to the front to take images of British soldiers doing things, and they were then sold as postcards as well. So for many people, the arrival of all these soldiers meant not the closure necessarily of their business, but the expansion of their business and the extension of their business, being able to sell postcards of sleepy backwaters like Chapval to tens of thousands of soldiers in a way that they could never have dreamt of before the Great War. Sorry, I'm just letting someone in there. And so men bought images of places that were on the battlefield. But of course, as we know, they spent as much time away from the battlefield as they did in the front line. So they buy a lot of images of those places. And this postcard of the main square of Popperinga is a very common postcard to find because soldiers, when they were in the camps around Popperinga, would have come into here and have gone into one or more of these many estaminets, these bars that we see around the square. A little bit up on the left-hand side is one of the famous officer estaminets, where it was said that there were more corks from champagne bottles popping there than shells falling on Popperinga. And then down the street just straight ahead of us there, this hospital street, Gasterstraat, and that takes you down to Talbot House, the old house, Tok H. And again, there are images of that. And indeed, Tok H during the war published its own postcard of the upper room that was then sold to soldiers as a souvenir, and the money used by Tubby Clayton to help those soldiers by buying provisions. And knowing him, he probably had one price for officers, which was high, and one price for ordinary soldiers, which was very low. So that was the kind of guy that he was. And many of these postcards, when you get them, have been censored. You can see this one has had the name of Popperinga struck out of it. Now, having been to Popperinga many times, even when I bought this, I didn't need to be told it was Popperinga. But the censor in this case has not done a very good job because he's struck out Popperinga at the top, but he's forgot to look at the bottom where it's got the name of the publisher, which is Sanson van Ester in Popperinga. So if this ever fell into German hands, then I suspect they might gather that it could have some connection to Popperinga. But another type of postcard, apart from postcards of places showing views of places that soldiers came into contact with during their military service, were official postcards, sometimes semi-official postcards that they could then use to send back to their family to tell them how they were. So the YMCA, and there's an example on the left there, published these postcards. They were blank, space on the back for the address to go on to, and these were often given for free to soldiers at YMCA huts behind the lines or at camps in Britain, so that they had something to write home with. And soldiers, as we know from the episode we did on the postal service and the Great War, did not have to pay for their post. It was free, so they could use these free postcards, write a message, and then send it off to whoever they wanted to send it to. And the army gave them these filled postcards, as we see on the right-hand side there, and they were issued from fairly early on. The earliest one that I've got is October 1914, and that would kind of make sense that once the war begins to become static and the army's contained in one area, which was Flanders, it would make sense that the army began to issue these things so that soldiers had an opportunity, even if they couldn't write a long note, they could at least send one of these filled postcards that said, I am well, or whatever else has happened to me. So this chap here, Bert, sends this on the 12th of February 1917 saying, I am well, I have been admitted into hospital sick and am going on well and hope to be discharged soon. Letter follows at first opportunity. I have received no letter from you for a long time. They all seem to say that. But these, you couldn't write anything else on them, although I've seen examples where people did, and soldiers filled them in. Some families got a bit windy when they received these because they would often be issued on the eve of a big attack. So just, the night before zero, then officers would come round, NCOs would come round, dish these out, men would fill them in, and then they would be sent subsequently to the families. And often they would arrive about the same time as a telegram saying that that lad had been killed in action, died of wounds, or been wounded on the battlefield, or was missing. So families came to realise when you receive one of these, sometimes it meant that your loved one was about to go into action, which obviously made them kind of somewhat alarmed and overthink that scenario, no doubt. But those are all kind of printed postcards and showing different aspects of a soldier's service. When we go back to the period before the First World War and the importance of photographing the self, photographing you and your family and your wider friendship group, that is also extended into the new armies that are created by the First World War. And we'll go through a few little postcards here now, kind of detailing this. And again, there'll be a Royal Sussex connection because, I've got a lot of images of them that I think are really great photographs, and this is a good example of it. So this shows Eastbourne men at Couden Camp. Now, Couden Camp is not far from Bexhill. Quite a lot of you have been in touch with me in the last week or so because Couden Camp made the news. There's an archaeological dig going on there at the moment where they're excavating part of the camp, and that camp is where the 11th, 12th and 13th Royal Sussex, the South Downs battalions, or Lowther's Lambs, were during the early part of their service from their formation in September 1914 through to just prior to them being taken over by the War Office and then going off to other places, Aldershot and Kent and Whitley, before they went off to France. But Couden Camp was their original camp, where it was established by Lieutenant Colonel Claude Lowther. Originally, as we see from this image, the men turned up. There were no uniforms for them, so they lived in their civilian clothes. They only had bell tents, which Lowther had bought, and eventually, over the course of the weeks and months that followed, they had huts and proper facilities and kind of everything else. And the current dig that's going on there has uncovered quite a lot of material, and I've been in touch with the archaeologists. And once their project is finished and they get permission from the organisation that's funding it, they're going to hopefully have a chat with me for the podcast, and we'll have an episode about the dig and the work that they've done there on this important camp from the First World War. But coming back to this image, what images like this show us, when we've got enough of them, is the kind of progression of the civilian army that was formed in the First World War by Britain and how it then kind of fared through its training and then onto the battlefield. So this shows us the early stage of it, men still in their civvy clothes, groups of men from one area brought together. Lowther's Lambs was a POWs battalion in everything but name. That phrase is never used to describe them, but that's what they were. And men from particular areas were brought together and were told they would not be split up and they would serve together. So all of these men were from different parts of Eastbourne, which was quite a big seaside town with quite a lot of industry and work, kind of clerks and things like that. So a very prosperous town before the Great War. And then we see the images that we kind of look at. This is not a Sussex one for a change. These are the Royal Fusiliers, possibly the 10th Battalion, Stockbrokers Battalion. And this shows their transition from civilians to soldiers. Some of the men are still in civvy clothes. Some of the men have got hold of khaki. They've got a variety of belts there. and I know this will interest some of you, quite a variety of different weapons there as well, which was very, very common with new army battalions. You see all kinds of weapons, including weapons that were long out of service, being dished out to Kitchener's units because that was the only thing they had. They often couldn't fire. They had DP painted on the butt, drill purposes only, so they were not to be fired. But at least they made some of these men look like soldiers when they marched up and down a bit. And that's what these kind of really important social documents that postcards are. That's kind of what they reflect when we look at images like this. And also to kind of catch up with the move from wearing civilian clothes into uniform, we have the new army adopting what is called Kitchener's blues. And this is a classic photograph showing those that style of uniform that soldiers wore, which wasn't that popular. A lot of them felt they looked like a prison outfit and they looked like prisoners. And this is a photograph of men from the 12th Battalion, the York and Lancaster Regiment. They are the Sheffield City Battalion. Now, I bought this in a junk shop, one of these famous junk shops in Eastbourne. And I bought it because I recognized initially I kind of cast my eye over it and thought, oh, it's a nice image showing the Kitchener's Blues uniform. And then my eye caught the soldier with the white flags. So that's a signaller. And he's got some collar badges on there, which is quite unusual sometimes with these uniforms. And I identified the badge of the York and Lancaster Regiment on there and knew that the Sheffield City Battalion had worn collar badges like this on the early uniforms that they had. And I didn't pay much attention. I was going to put that with the other postcards that I bought. And when I was sitting on the train coming home, I got this out and I looked at it. And I looked at that man with the white flags and I had to pinch myself because that is Reg Glenn, who was a veteran that I knew of the Sheffield City Battalion, who went over the top on the first day of the Battle of the Somme and survived that, became the Padre's friend, played the trench organ, and Beverly Palin's here tonight. You may remember that episode that she did with us where she played the trench organ that she has, which is named after Reg Glenn, because that's something that he'd done in the Great War. And I rung him up subsequently. I called him. I said, Reg, you're not going to believe this. I've picked up a postcard with you on it. He said, "Oh, I don't still owe him the money for it, do I?" Which was kind of typical of that kind of humour of that generation. But he was astonished. So I sent him a print of it, offered to send him the original. He said, "Oh, I've got enough pictures of myself, thanks." And there it is. So I mean, we often say it. I don't believe in coincidence. A long time ago, stopped believing in coincidence. But somehow this image was kind of meant to come to me with old Reg Glenn on there. So quite something. But what it shows us in a kind of wider context rather than just Reg is the development of the uniforms for this movement of men, a million of them who joined the new army, Kitchener's army in 1914, and how the army clothed them and how it billeted them. And often you have images of them feeding, so how it fed them as well. And then you kind of move as the army does equip them, does give them proper units, gives them training. You have a lot of images like this showing physical drill. And this is an interesting little series of images called Days of the Great War, published by a photographer called George Chapman from Bexhill-on-Sea. These are not men from the Royal Sussex Regiment; they're gunners in the Royal Field Artillery, because when the South Downs battalions pulled out of Couden Camp, the Royal Field Artillery moved in, and this is Couden in 1916 after the South Downs had left. But what it shows again from a wider context is what soldiers look like on a typical physical drill parade. So they're there to go running around, marching around, possibly picking up logs, carrying them around. They had the kind of Indian clubs, which were a bit like rounders bats that they would do physical drill with and things like that. But again, an incredibly important kind of social document where we can look into the faces and the physiques of these men to see again, kind of what the physical fitness and physical physiques of that generation were like in army service at that period of the war. And if we had a similar image of conscripts from 1918 on the same parade ground, which I sadly don't have, I wish I did, but it would show a very different type of soldier in terms of their physique, because the conscription pointed to the terrible problems that Britain had had with pollution and poor diet and men in 1918. There are photographs of a draft at Etaples that show this, of very kind of weedy looking individuals compared to these men who look physically quite fit and strong and well. And again, I guess it kind of shows us so many different facets of the war just through an image. And soldiers liked as well to get postcards of the camps that they were in. Almost every camp in Britain had a series of postcards about it. This is Summerdown Camp in Eastbourne, still in Sussex, looking out towards the sea there. And this was a massive complex that was a camp, was a training ground for the Royal Army Medical Corps. Was also there was hospital facilities there as well. It's got some of the civilian buildings in the foreground, and then the newly constructed huts in the middle part of the image. And this site grew and grew and grew. And during the centenary, Eastbourne recognised the importance of this camp with information boards and various other things. But this is a typical example of a real photograph of a typical camp that soldiers bought postcards of, again, as part of the kind of beacon to that aspect of their military service. Now, this one is a very unusual postcard, and it is an image. It's a postcard. It's a 5 by 3 inch postcard, and it's got a photograph on it of every single officer, and they're all named. Every single officer who served with the 3rd Battalion, the East Surrey Regiment, from 1914 to 1917. Now, I think the photographer must have had normal portraits and literally stuck them on a wall and then photographed them to produce this. And again, it's such high resolution that I've put this on a scanner and I can pick out these individual images and pick out named officers and research them. It's quite incredible. This came with a little collection of stuff to an officer called Lieutenant Brown, who was who lied about his age, lied about his background, changed his name to Brown, and joined the Munster Fusiliers before the Great War as a regular soldier, and then was commissioned in 1917 into the Surrey Regiment and was killed in the Battle of the Lys in 1918, and has no known grave. He's on the Plugsturt Memorial. But he's on here in one of these pictures. But it's such a kind of incredible kind of archive, really, of the officers that served with that reserve battalion, which was a training unit that then sent men overseas. And I've seen other images like this. I mean, not quite as good as this, but this is another kind of way, I guess, to mark your service rather than just have kind of photographs of you and your mates. Then you can have photographs of everyone that's been in your unit. But when I get to the battlefield, that kind of group identity image is still taken when they're on active service, because while they've left behind the photographers in Britain, when they get to the Western Front, they find a lot of places where there are photographic studios where they can go to. And this building still exists. It's a small little chateau near to the town of Corby on the Somme. It's right near a railway station. So it's a place where soldiers were coming and going all the time, going to the front, from the front, and then being billeted in the kind of wider Corby, La Nouvelle area. And they would then come here for photographs. And when I lived on the Somme, I had a few of these with this particular background. I somehow picked up a few and then thought that there's a bit of a connection, something going on here. And I spent a few days one year trying to track this building down, which I did. And ever since, every time I've seen a postcard with this background, I've always tried to pick it up. So I've got a lot of different ones showing all kinds of units. And there's an interesting commonality. So the early ones are mainly men from the 21st Division that went over the top between Fricourt and La Boisselle on the first day of the Battle of the Somme. So you get Lincolns, a lot of their support units like Royal Engineers and Royal Field Artillery and units like that. Then you get quite a few men in the 34th Division photographed there. The One of the images that I've got is shows the 9th Battalion officers and the 9th Battalion King's Own Yorkshire Line Infantry. They were the ones who toasted before they went into action when the barrage lifts. And then later on, and this is an image from the late summer, early autumn of 1916, the 51st Highland Division were billeted there. And this is the 1st, 5th Seaforths and one of their companies. And the men on the back of this, it says these are the survivors of the original battalion that came out in 1915. a photograph for posterity. And what you get when you compare this type of image to the images taken in Britain, where you've got keen, excited, well dressed, clean, kind of soldiers on home service, we're seeing a very different kind of soldier in this image, where they're very much their uniform is part of them and they're part of their uniform. And we can see that they're on active service. We can see some chalk on their boots, and we can see that they've changed really in all kinds of ways since those early photographs. And I do have some examples of the same group of men photographed in Britain and then photographed on active service, and it is amazing to kind of the difference. In some cases, it's only a year, but it could be 10 years when you look into the faces of those men. And then you get studios. So that one was taken in a village behind the lines, and that's not uncommon. Quite a few of the villages on the Somme, you could find these studios. This is a bit nearer the front. This is in the city of Arras, and this is right near the cathedral, where a photographer pretty much operated for most of the war. And you could turn up, and people like these because that previous image, it's in France, but it could be anywhere. This has got a battle damaged, war damaged structure behind it, so it's quite clear that you're on active service. So having your photograph taken here, you are making a kind of statement. Look at me, I'm on the front line, I'm doing the fighting, I'm at the sharp end of this war. And I've seen other images taken by this photographer, which also feature those pickelhaubers that we can see in the foreground there. So I suspect he'd managed to acquire a couple of them and he used them as props. But this is a really interesting photograph showing Royal Engineer signallers and showing not just them, but some of their equipment, their lines, their tools, and their buzzers and their sets, their telephone sets. So it gives us a fantastic kind of insight into the gear that Royal Engineer, probably divisional level signallers, were using on the battlefield. And an incredible, again, kind of look into the faces of these guys. We're getting an insight into the kind of men that fought at Arras during the Great War. But then we kind of move on to the images, the postcards, again, of the self, of portraits of yourself and your wider family. And this kind of photograph is very, very common before a soldier goes on active service. This is a warrant officer in the military foot police, and he's had an image taken by a professional photographer in Britain of him and his wife, and his baby child, so that he's got this in his pocket when he's on active service, and he can look at that when he's at the front and think back to the family, the reason he's fighting, and the loved ones he has at home. And this is a very common kind of image to see. And occasionally, over the years of going to junk sales in France, car boot sales and brocants and Vide Grenier and all these kind of things, you'd find these, and I'd often wonder, I mean, how did that end up in France? Was that left behind in a billet? Was it dropped on the battlefield and picked up by somebody? I mean, who knows? Because sadly, so often these things just don't have names on the back, and we haven't a clue who they are. But photographs of individual soldiers are really important. And one of the things that I've often been asked, and to this day, particularly on Facebook groups, when someone comes on and they're researching an ancestor, is were all soldiers photographed during the First World War by the army? They weren't. There was no official photographer that photographed people for identity cards. None of that kind of thing existed in either World War for the vast majority of soldiers, and certainly not at all in the First World War. So when we see portrait photographs like this, these are ones that soldiers have had commissioned of themselves by a photographer. They've gone to a studio and they've had their portrait taken, put onto postcard, and then it's given to the wider family, friends, and whatever. And on the left, we've got a soldier of the Hampshire Regiment, probably from 1915, given the fact that he's wearing a gore blimey winter issue cap, and a very smart looking Coldstream Guardsman on the right there, in taken in Britain before he went on active service. Two fantastic images, really kind of classic images of soldiers of the Great War. And I think, just tell us a lot about the style of uniform, how men looked in uniforms. I think a lot of people that make drama about the First World War could do with looking at some of these images to get a real better idea as to what men looked like when they were in military uniform in conflict. And some of these images that I've got, I particularly like portrait images because it is, as a photographer, it's very difficult to take really good photographs of people. You can take a lot of mediocre ones, but really good ones is the sign of a really good photographer, a gifted photographer. And some of those that I've got, like these, are just absolutely stunning images. I mean, whoever this photographer was, he was a very, very clever and gifted man indeed. And these are classic images of two men from the Queen Victoria Rifles from the second Ninth Londons, actually. This is down near Winchester, where that battalion was based, and it's a photographer down there. Sadly, I don't know the name of the photographer, and it's one of a whole series of pictures I've got of men from this unit that was taken by him. He's used depth of field really skillfully there to really make these pictures pop. And again, if you kind of wanted to show a kind of classic insight into what Great War soldiers look like, this is certainly it. Some years ago, unfortunately, it never happened. I was going to do a project with Experience Barnsley, which is the museum in Barnsley, where we were going to do an exhibition called Unknown Soldiers of the Great War, where we were going to use images like this and do basically a kind of photographic exhibition of them. And Barnsley Town Hall is a massive building. It's as big as Buckingham Palace, and it's a white stone Portland building, and we were going to beam images like this up onto the building. Unfortunately, that never happened. And if anyone subsequently listens to this and can come up with another building and the funding to do that project somewhere else, then I'd love to hear from them. But stunning images, and we can't mention, we've mentioned a lot about the army. We've got to mention the other arms of service as well, and those servicemen and women who were in the Navy and the Air Force also had their images taken, both in Britain and on active service. If you go to any of the places where the main docks were, like Chatham and Portsmouth and Plymouth, there were dozens of photographic studios there where sailors could go to get their image after they'd done their kind of basic training and then send that home to their mum. So that kind of picture we see on the left there is very common. And the man on the right in the Royal Flying Corps shows typical RFC maternity jacket, as they were called, with this kind of wraparound front, fixes at the top, and gives us a bit of an insight into the uniform worn by RFC ground crew in that early period of the Great War. And we mentioned women because that's a really important part of it too. This was a war in which there was societal change on just about every level, and for the first time in British history, huge numbers of young women served in some capacity in the Great War. We closely associate women as nurses, like the VAD, the member of the Voluntary Aid Detachment on the left there, who was an untrained nurse, but has acted as a volunteer to work alongside professional nurses in the military hospitals, casualty clearing stations, and so on, behind the lines. But women's work in the Great War was not just about nursing. It covered a huge, broad spectrum of different things. And the young woman on the right there is a munitions worker from a London munitions factory. I don't know which one. And she's got a war service triangle badge on there, which I think is a 1915 one. And she's wearing a typical uniform that was worn by munition workers during the First World War. And I remember buying images, particularly like that of the munitions worker, from postcard dealers and shop, and they would say, what do you want that? Look at that woman. She's in terrible clothes there if you're into women's clothes." Well, I wasn't into women's clothes, but but they couldn't really understand quite, the fascination of this. But again, I would just reiterate this point. These are incredibly important social documents that are really kind of part of our history and tell us so much about this history. And again, like with the group photographs, when we're looking at the image of the self, and we move to active service, we see a very different type of portrait being taken. And these are two typical active service photographs of ordinary soldiers. The one on the left, there's always a dog involved somewhere. In fact, there's dogs on both of these. You can just see if you look on the right-hand side, one tucked around the corner. I'm never sure whether his right hand's giving it a biscuit, but anyway, I like to think so. But the one on the left is in the garden of some French guy's house. That was a really common scenario for studios where they'd buy the kit and equipment to take photographs, put a chair in their garden. Tommies would come along, one stand up, one sit down, and then have their photograph taken, then come back for it, be printed on the postcard. The one on the right is by the same photographer who took the signals guys, the Royal Engineer signals guys, in that group photograph with the Pickelhaube. And it's in one of the buildings near to Arras Cathedral. That arch background is one that's very, very common for that area. And I've got a few dozen pictures taken on that spot from quite a broad period from 1916 until the end of the war. And I saw an exhibition in Arras one year where they displayed some of the ones from the earlier period showing French soldiers being photographed in the same place. But again, what these images are really good for is they show us what men looked like on active service, how they wore their clothes and equipment, what kind of state they were in, and we get, I think, a lot again by just looking at the faces of these men. And it's not just France and Flanders. You know, these are examples of very similar images from other theatres of war. I don't need to tell you where the one on the left is, but the images taken beneath um, the pyramids in Egypt were very, very common before the First World War, during the First World War, and then on into the Second World War. I have almost identical images of British soldiers that were out there on rest from Italy, for example, photographed in exactly the same place. And there's always a couple of camels and a donkey and a bloke holding a pot somewhere involved. And you could rock up. If you look at the bottom, there's a little number at the bottom. That would be the negative number. You rocked up, had your got on one of them animals, had your picture taken. They gave you that number and they took your name. You come back the next day and it would be printed onto postcard. You can send it home to your mum. So that's one from Egypt. And those men went on, in that photograph, went on to fight in the Palestine campaign, in Gaza, in the battles of Gaza in 1917. And the chap on the right, that's photographed as a street photographer in Salonika, in the town of Salonika, on the Salonika front. It's a soldier of the Duke of Cornwall's Line Infantry. I can just see two active service chevrons on his right lower sleeve, which dates that from 1918. And he's wearing KD uniform, khaki drill, kind of lighter uniform for a much warmer theatre of war. He's got shorts on, which you see quite commonly in those kind of theatres of war and indeed on the Western Front. And it just shows that no matter where the British soldier was posted, there were photographers there to record him, to record his mates, and to record the places and the deeds and everything else around him. And if we look to the kind of wider empire that was involved in the war, again, that's almost a kind of subject in its own right, looking at postcards of Australians, Canadians, New Zealanders, South Africans, but I've got to throw a few in. And we've got two here showing Australian troops on the left-hand side and a British buddy from the Royal Army Medical Corps, and then some Canadian engineers on the right. Now, the Canadian engineers, that's a studio that was near to Mont Saint Eloi, northwest of Arras. And a lot of Canadians were photographed there, and that background of the leaves, for example, this is why it's really important to really look at these pictures, because you can find a commonality that helps you then identify a time and a place where these images were taken. They appear on quite a lot of images of that period. And these men, Canadian engineers, almost certainly were going to be involved in the attack on Vimy Ridge, perhaps even in the preparation for the digging the galleries, the tunnels that took Canadian soldiers up to the front line. So that's a kind of very interesting kind of snapshot of that classic period of Canadian history on the Western Front. The one on the left, it's a bunch of diggers from July 1918, a couple of days after the attack at Le Hamel, which maybe the two men at the back took part in. Some of the guys that were based where I know this photograph was taken were certainly in that battle. And I do know where it's taken, although there is nothing written on it because of the background. These little backdrops, painted backdrops, were common in many photographic studios, and the photographers bought them as part of the package that they bought from a bigger company to set up their photographic business. They'd buy the camera, the tripod, all the equipment that was needed to expose the film, create prints, and all that kind of stuff, and you get a backdrop as well. And I bought this a long time ago, and it was the first one I'd ever seen, because I'm trying to think how long ago that was now, but I was involved in the purchase of and the acquisition of the Lost Diggers and the Lost Tommies photographs at Vignacourt on the Somme. And that is the backdrop that was used by Louis Thuillier, the photographer there, and it appears in almost all of the images that he took in his courtyard and the central parts of his buildings. And I took this along because there's a museum there now of these images. This is not one that they actually have a negative of, interestingly. They don't have negatives of every single image that was taken. But I took it along to the museum and they'd never seen an original print. So they're obviously very keen to try and take it from me. Maybe I'll leave it to them one day. But it certainly, shows that there were these incredible archives out there. That one at Vignacourt survives. I know of another one from Waloy Ballon. One was discovered up in Flanders a few years ago, but there must be others out there too, because there were probably hundreds and hundreds of these kind of studios dotted along the back area of just the Western Front, for example. And of course, when you're talking about the wider empire, you're not just talking about white soldiers. It was not just a white man's war. And what you find by collecting images like this, and this is one of the things that first alerted me to the huge number of black soldiers that were in the British Armed Forces during the First World War, is finding postcards depicting them. And this shows on the left a soldier of the British West Indies Regiment in Egypt in 1917-18. They were out there, a number of their British West Indies battalions were out there serving alongside the British. They actually took part in some combat actions there against the Turks. The British Army didn't see the Turks as white men, so it was quite legitimate to use black soldiers to fight against the Turks, whereas they wouldn't allow that on the Western Front. And this man's colleagues who served in France and Flanders were just used as Labour troops. And on the right there, this is an image taken in France of men of the Indian Labour Corps. So this is a French photographer who's taken this photograph. It's not at Vignacourt, it's in one of those villages somewhere behind the front in that area. And it shows three men of the Indian Labour Corps with probably two local French girls, because the French really kind of rated black soldiers, were fascinated by black soldiers. And you see that in their own kind of postal history, postcard history of the First World War. But images like this, these active service images, this is what gives us really a kind of photographic insight into just what a wider war this was. And for ordinary soldiers, there were postcards produced for Christmas time. That's a 7th Division postcard showing the Asiago heights up in Italy during the winter of 1917-18. The Asiago, always looking down, I suspect, onto the Asiago plateau. And then a 42nd East Lancs Division Christmas card from the same kind of period. Again, every division, sometimes every unit had these, and there's a whole kind of collecting sphere with those. And other theatres of war were involved as well. And these are two from the British Salonika Army from the latter part of the First World War, showing British soldier about to finish off the Turks and the Bulgarians he was fighting against in Salonika. And then a typical British soldier in a kind of mountainous region of Salonika on the back of a mule with his cap raised in victory, which was going to come soon. But also postcards were used to remember the dead. So these are two postcards that were turned into in memoriam cards. Essentially, they're not as common in Britain as they are, for example, in Catholic Germany. But you see these kind of cards being used to hand out to a wider family and friends when a soldier is killed, so that they can use it as a kind of memorial. Sometimes you see them being used for soldiers who are missing, because they pass these around hoping that someone will recognize the image, recognize the person in the image, and be able to tell them what happened to their son, their brother, their husband, whatever it is. These are less common, but they are certainly kind of very interesting social documents. And the one on the right is kind of almost like a newspaper obituary. And then this kind of whole postal history eventually, I mean, we've only touched a very tiny aspect of it, eventually comes to an end with the war on the Western Front, and the images reflect that. With the war on the Western Front coming to an end, you begin to see images of the landscape as it was at the end of that fighting, which kind of leads us into the post-war world and that interwar period of 1920s and 30s, when probably all of those businesses that had thrived on the millions of Allied soldiers behind the lines on the Western Front thought, that's it, we're going to go bankrupt now, we're never going to see that money again, only to see hundreds of thousands of visitors going across to the battlefields in the interwar period, and a new type of postcard history developing from that, particularly associated around pilgrimage and cemeteries and war memorials, which we see these two covers of postcard books depicting, and these ones from Flanders showing the kind of various things that were there. The Hindenburg line was a system of trenches that were constructed at Hill 60, which we can see two different sets produced there. Tynescop, the largest British cemetery, was obviously on the itineraries of all tour groups in the 20s and 30s, and you see a lot of postcard booklets being produced for that. The postcards show the whole development of the cemeteries from the way they were at the end of the conflict with the wooden crosses, which you can see here. This is Ypres Reservoir Cemetery, rather. So this is just behind the prison in Ypres. It was then called Ypres Prison Cemetery until its name was changed. And we can see even graves here still with steel helmets on them, for example. And eventually, within a few years, as the cemeteries are made permanent, postcard producers reflect that with a whole series of images showing the cemeteries, the silent cities, as Kipling called them, developing into permanent gardens of stone. And Nels, who was a postcard company based up in the northern part of Belgium, produced a massive series of these. I don't think they photographed every single cemetery around Ypres, but it a very high proportion of them. I think I've got about over 100 different ones of the cemeteries. There's 174 in theory, and I've found about 100 of them. Whether there are some rarer ones out there, I mean, who knows? The thing about the Great War is you continue to discover things, and things still surprise you. But these images from the late 20s on into the early 30s again are important because it shows the development of the cemetery. If you zoom in on this one, you can see some of the graves have yet to be replaced. So the original crosses are still there and the headstone hasn't been put in at that particular point. And of course, the memorials get photographed and put onto postcard as well. The Menin Gate, once it's constructed by 1927, is photographed and photographed and photographed again. But you see occasionally some unusual images of the gate, like this one. This is taken from one of the central walkways looking down into the area. We can see wreaths on the trestles near to the steps, and we can see some of the names on the wall as well. But it wasn't just the big memorials that was photographed, it was some of the smaller ones and the lesser known ones, because somewhere along the line, everyone was trying to visit everything in some respects, because not everyone had a relative on the Menin Gate. Some, as with this one, this is the village just down the road from the village of Richbourg. This is the Touré Memorial to the Missing, and there are thousands of British soldiers on there and thousands of families that may want to have come along and bought a postcard. And the town of Bethune, just down the road, became a lesser known one, but it became another big hub for British pilgrims in that interwar period, and there were shops selling these kind of postcards there. And they also reflected what people found on the battlefields as well. This is a postcard produced by Anthony of Ypres, well-known local photographer who photographed Ypres long before the Great War, photographed it at the beginning of the war, then he was evacuated, and then he came back and he photographed the landscape as it was when the war was at an end. And this is Hellfire Corner on the Menin Road, showing the British demarcation stone there. And these images begin to give us an insight into that wasteland that the battlefields had become, populated with these almost like monuments to a prehistoric age or another kind of civilization, in this case, tanks. And this is an image of a whole series of images showing the tank wrecks of the tank cemetery between Ypres and up on the Menin Road up towards Stirling Castle. And that remained a really big kind of tourist attraction, if that's the right word, up until the outbreak of the Second World War, when the Germans in World War II took all these things away for scrap. Although bits of them have been found in recent years. Simon Verdigam found some found some parts of a tank during one of his digs a year or so ago, for example. And of course, trenches. The trenches are gradually being filled in. So the places where the trenches are still in existence, such as this is Sanctuary Wood Trench Museum. These become images put onto postcards, which pilgrims take home. So just as the soldiers kind of bought images that acted as beacons to their war service, the pilgrims bought images like this that acted as similar beacons to what they'd seen during their pilgrimage, during their visit to those battlefields. And that would include mine craters, of course, as well. This is the mine crater at La Boisselle, The most visited one was the Weissap crater on the Albert Bapaume Road, but this one I'm pretty sure is Loch Nagar, which was tucked down a kind of little side track then, and was less visited than it is today. Weissap, of course, having been filled in. But it wasn't just pilgrims on the battlefields that continued to buy postcards, and postcards continued to mean something to them. Across Britain, war memorials were constructed. And this kind of image showing a war memorial in an English churchyard is so common. This is the village of Framfield in Sussex, and the vicar of the church was Edmund Blunden's father, the war poet Edmund Blunden. This is the village where he went to war from in 1915. And that particular war memorial has about 30 names on it. Myself and one of my old school chums, we got particularly interested in this memorial and researched all the names, and we visited all those lads that were buried in France and Flanders, a couple at Gallipoli. But at the time, these images again were purchased by ordinary people because they knew that their husband, brother, son, uncle, whatever it was on there, and these became really kind of important identifiers in the greater sacrifice that Britain had made in the First World War. And postcard photographers continued to photograph people. They photographed connected to the Great War, veterans, of course, and groups of veterans who met to remember. This one I know nothing about, sadly, except that it's up in Yorkshire somewhere. They've got quite a sprinkling of medals, including gallantry medals. There's a military cross, distinguished conduct medal on there. And this is a group of men who possibly had served together in a Yorkshire related unit, and possibly around the time of Armistice Day had come to remember and got a local photographer to take their image. And individual portraits continued as well. And although these men are no longer in uniform, on those portraits in their civvy clothes, we can find identifiers that connect them and connect us to their Great War history. The man on the left has got a Silver War badge on a little chain on his jacket there, indicating that he's a man discharged through sickness or wounds in the Great War. These were worn very, very proudly in that interwar period to show that you had served, and not just served, you'd been badly injured as a consequence of your service. And the man on the right on his wedding day is not just wearing his Silver War badge, he's wearing his military medal and bar. So this, I mean, often the veterans used to joke that medals came up with the rations, but an and bar is definitely not given as a ration token. That's a man who knows what his war service was, who knows what he'd seen, and kind of who knows what pathways he trod along that old front line. And we end not with a postcard, but a photograph taken by me on my very first trip to Ypres in 1982. And anyone who's kind of interested in classic cars, probably that's the first thing they start looking at. But for me, when I look at this was the beginning of my journey along the old front line by getting to somewhere like Ypres for the first time. And there's a connection to the postcards because many of those same shops that sold postcards to battlefield pilgrims, and probably before then, before they were destroyed in the war, sold local postcards to British Tommies in that early phase of the Great War, still had the same stock in those shops when I went there in 1982. And that was for me where my Great War postcard journey began, because I realized that they'd put images connected to this history onto postcard, and you could find these and you could collect them. And it wasn't just like collecting stamps. This was a pathway into the history of the Great War, which is why I'll always argue that postcards of the First World War are incredibly important social history, military history documents that help us understand the wider aspects of this history. So I hope that's been of interest.